Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Christina Ochusa, and I'm the co-president of the Duke Law Chapter of the American Constitution Society. For those of you who are unfamiliar with ACS, we are a progressive legal organization which seeks to promote individual rights, liberties, genuine equality, access to justice, democracy, and the rule of law. On behalf of ACS and our co-sponsor, Outlaw, we would like to welcome you to this discussion between two exceptionally talented North Carolina natives. Our guest for today is Chapel Hill Mayor Mark Kleinschmidt, who was first elected to office in our neighboring town in 2009. Because the following discussion will cover much of his background, I don't want to give anything away, but suffice it to say he has truly led an extraordinary life dedicated to public service. And leading the discussion is Duke Law's own Professor Joseph Blocher. Professor Blocher returned to his hometown in Durham to join the Duke Law faculty in 2009 and received the Distinguished Teaching Award in 2012. His principal academic interests include federal and state constitutional law, the First and Second Amendments, capital punishment, and property, and he has been published in a number of the nation's most prestigious journals. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Professor Blocher.
Thank you so much, Christina, and thanks to all of you for being here. Let me just add a few things by way of sort of preface. One is that ACS is going to be putting on a lot of these kinds of events, so if you enjoy this kind of discussion, pay attention to what Anna and Christina and the rest of the leadership are putting together. There'll be a lot more follow-up. And in speaking of related events, if you're interested in this issue or this broad set of issues, I'd encourage you tonight at 5 o'clock in the Smith Warehouse to attend Professor Siegel's talk called Same-Sex Marriage and the Authority of Tradition, which you can see it was on the DLD and should be on the list. And we'll pick up, I think, some of the same themes that the mayor and I will be talking about here today. We scheduled this event long before Kim Davis started taking all the headlines, which is in some respects really useful because now we've got a real illustration out in the world of how important local politics and local politicians are. And we just lucked out that we got the mayor booked for this because your life has, in your professional career, has really sort of played out against the background of the development of these issues, and you've been there sort of ground zero on a lot of things. So I thought that just to get us started, we'll sort of talk through a little bit of sort of the path of your career and sort of how you got where you are, because that actually I think brings out some of the themes that may be interesting to many of you, how to live sort of a life as a progressive politician, as a progressive lawyer, be involved in politics, specific issues like the death penalty, and so on. Christina mentioned that you're a native, as am I, so maybe you can talk about... Yeah, so that's actually a complicated thing. You can say about that, maybe.
Right, yeah, I actually grew up in the military, and we ended up here in North Carolina when I was 10 years old. So yeah, I mean, 35 years of being in North Carolina, I get to call it home. Particularly whenever neither of my parents, were from the same place. Like one was from Pennsylvania, another from Minnesota. They met in Georgia. There was never a home, you know. So yeah, moving here is, I often actually tell people that Chapel Hill is my hometown because why not? You know,
it's a nice town.
It sure as hell is in Goldsboro, where I lived for 8 whole years of my life. Yeah.
And even then, it seems to me that your eye was on Chapel Hill, and that specifically, I would think that one moment that might have been important while you're still living in Goldsboro would have been the election of Joe Herzenberg. And
oh yeah.
Just say a little bit about that. There's no reason anybody would know that name, but it's a significant one.
Yeah, Joe Herzenberg is really an iconic figure in LGBT history in North Carolina. He was the first openly gay person elected to office in North Carolina, and we think in the entire South. And that was in 1987, which to me doesn't seem that long ago, because I was a senior in high school, and I remember I was applying. And the only school I ever wanted to go to was Carolina, because when I moved to North Carolina, in 5th grade, you're asked immediately, what's your favorite color, blue or red? And I like blue, so I was going to Carolina. And Duke doesn't exist in the consciousness of Eastern North Carolinians. I don't know if you realize that. Just state in Carolina. So I always knew I really wanted to come here because the basketball team, not here, there. But in this fall of 1987, the big news on Election Day, because it's an off-year election year, so just had these municipal races around North Carolina. Joe Herzenberg was elected to the town council in Chapel Hill, an open homosexual. And that's what the the newscaster says, you know? And it's kind of funny now, and you go back and you think about that, but that's exactly how they said it. And I just explode inside. Inside my closet, I exploded. And I just knew at that moment that there was no other place that I could go. And in fact, applied to no other university. It was all in on light blue, and got lucky, got it paid for.
Well, and actually that's worth talking about, because I'm looking around I know some of my students here who were teachers before they came to law school, and this is a part of your story as well, because you were part of the maybe inaugural part of it, the Teaching Fellows program at UNC, right. Which so it goes from there to your experiences teaching. Maybe we could talk a little bit about.
Right. Who are the teachers? Are there any teachers in here?
You guys are going to out yourself.
Oh, good. Yeah. Yeah, I was a teacher. I was a North Carolina teaching fellow. The first class at Carolina, the second class overall in the state. See, back in the 80s, the legislature actually believed that investing in education was, really one of its mandates. Like, this is the reason you go to Raleigh to be a legislator, is to secure investments in education. And the reason why that was so, I think that legislators believed that was because we had developed this not the southern state, but by the 80s, we weren't, we were the progressive beacon of the South. And the reason I think we had achieved that status is because of the investments we had in public education and in higher education in particular. And so one of the things that they were concerned about back in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, was the quality of teaching in our schools, and they created this scholarship program. They were going to go find these bright kids in high school and train them up to be teachers. And I got lucky. That's what paid for me to go to school, which is good news because I was the first person in my family to go to college. So, until I figured out how to get it paid for, we weren't sure how we were going to figure out how to get there. It really kind of defined it defined who I was and what I thought of myself as far as a important role I could play in North Carolina, which is be a teacher. Of course, then I go to college. Remember that I was in a closet. That closet door was welded, just welded shut, 6 or 7 locks on it. But it finally, cracked. And then I was really upset. I was really concerned because I was afraid I wouldn't be able to be a teacher. Because that's what it meant to be gay in the 80s and in 1989, 1990. It's like, you don't know whether you can actually be a teacher. Actually, that's still true today. So it hasn't really changed that much, at least I think the public response to those issues has changed. I hope it has. So at least a principal, I think, would face public condemnation if they fired a teacher for that reason. But they wouldn't have then. And I know my principal would have been applauded if he had found out and then fired me when I ended up teaching. So. Yeah.
This is one of just those interesting places where I said, like, your professional careers intersected with these issues, because we get that relationship between sexuality and open sexuality and role playing out in a very different context now with Kim Davis. But your experience in teaching, it seemed to be remarkably successful, and really enjoyed it, and awarded
it was
Teacher
great.
of the Year and everything.
I was Teacher of the Year, but I started off as being like the last teacher left on the roster after my first year. I remember being hired as a teacher in West Mecklenburg High School. Anybody here from Charlotte? No? Okay. Well, so I can characterize it any way I want. You'll believe me. In Charlotte, it's interesting. There's, people think of it as this new South City and all these, a seat of progressive politics, home to Pat McCrory, for good or bad. But it's really interesting when you go to Charlotte, up until at least the late 90s, there's literally a railroad track that kind of cuts the city in half just to the west of the uptown area. On the west side of that railroad track, there are no movie theaters. There were no successful retail destinations. That's where abandoned warehouses were. And largely, the population is African American. And that's what it was like when I moved to Charlotte to teach high school. So I actually actively sought out a school that would be in that kind of a community, because that's what a teaching fellow was supposed to do. And when I got there, I was completely unprepared. And by the end of the first year, I was almost fired. I mean, my principal was like, one hair out of line, one complaint, and you're out of here. But I was fortunate enough that second year was better than the first. The fifth year was, teacher of the year. Yeah, it turned out pretty well.
And from there, and so even in the midst of that success, you made the decision to go to law school, leave this behind. What was driving that decision?
Well, I guess described the school, this very challenged school, high poverty. I don't think there was a student who wasn't on free or reduced lunch. I mean, it was just one of those 100% schools. But it was also one of those schools where I would walk into class, and during those 5 years, there wasn't a year in which I didn't lose at least one student. And I don't mean like they failed out, because more than half of them did that. And I don't mean that they moved away. I mean, they were killed, and they were no longer living by the end of that year. And that happened with at least once every single year that I was there. And I realized, that there's all these times too whenever I was wondering if anybody else really cared. I remember particularly in one instance in my fourth year teaching, which really said, I'm getting the hell out of here. I'm not to escape, but to go find another skill set in order to somehow address the issues of the community more effectively than I'm doing in room 115. It was when one of my students who had been murdered. He was at home with his mother. Doorbell rings. He goes and answers the door. He opens the door, and he's shot. And his mom runs to him, and he dies in his mother's arms. I mean, it's just this horrible story that I learn about when I'm watching Channel 9, WSOC in Charlotte, where the very attractive talking head, smiles and tells the story and makes sure that you still are comfortable with this murder of a 17-year-old by reminding you that he had a criminal history before he was murdered. On to the Panthers, and then I was like, well, first of all, his criminal history, which I had known about, was stupid. Simple assault charges. There were trespassing charges. They were, just kind of made up stuff to keep kids moving kind of charges. So he didn't even have a legitimate, criminal record. He just had some charges on his record. But you can feel okay. Just another dead kid from the west side of town who already had a criminal history. Whew, got rid of that one. And that was the message of the news that night. It was horrified. And so I was like, I'm out of here. I'm going to go to law school. So that's how
And this is, again, if it's not already obvious that this is still a conversation that's happening today. We talk about, obviously, those of you who've been, and some students who have been very involved with those issues. By the time you get to law school, it seems like pretty quickly figured out a focus, or at least one potential focus, which was capital punishment.
Right.
And I wondered if you could say about how you got to that, and if it was those kinds of experiences that led you to death penalty law. As some students here will be very interested in those issues.
Yeah, sure. As a 1L, one of the only things I was able to do as far as volunteering and doing pro bono work was to do juror interviews in capital cases. And so I quickly signed up for this death penalty project program, where I was actually assigned to go out and interview jurors who had sentenced someone to death. And it was just fascinating. Because not only was I meeting these people who would say, yes, kill him, which is just interesting whenever you actually meet those people. Because actually, I'm doing that disservice, because it's not, no juror I met took their job in an unserious way. I mean, they were all and I think many of them are actually, have some level of post-traumatic stress disorder over the fact that they have. I mean, it is a very difficult thing for jurors to do. But so that in itself is interesting. But then I started learning about the clients that I was working for and the legal teams that were representing them. And I saw my students in the stories of these clients. And I was like, well, this is what I got to do. These clients had grown up in poverty. They'd had few had ever have any kind of high school diploma, none any kind of university degree, many of them with mental illness, history of learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities, and I just saw my kids in them. So I was really attracted to that work, and that's ultimately what I did after graduating.
And one of the ways that students here, I mean, you guys may already be involved with the Innocence Project or in some form or another. One of the most famous innocence cases in North Carolina in recent history is that you were deeply involved with. And let me just plug the book here, not one that the mayor wrote, but there's a book called Last Lawyer about the very famous case of Bo Jones. And just tell us about Bo Jones.
You worked on that too, didn't you?
I should also, this may be a good place to interject, that my very first job as a 1L was working for the mayor here. Yeah, so those of you looking for 1L jobs now, you can do worse than working for someone who may end up being your mayor.
Yeah, so Levon Bo Jones, to this day I can't think, every time that Elton John song comes on, I think about him. But Bo is, his case was like the perfect storm of errors and, why the death penalty just is just a boondoggle. And his lawyer had a legal conflict that should have kept him out of the case. He had intellectual disability, which at the time we called mental retardation. There wasn't a statute that forbid it, but during the course of the litigation, a new statute and case law came down that forbid the execution of people with intellectual disabilities. He was mentally ill, and it manifested itself in all kinds of unfortunate ways for him. It made him a very easy person to target. So if you wanted to frame someone, it was very believable that this person with mental illness, intellectual disability, could maybe have done it. Right? He had law enforcement that didn't turn over materials to the district attorney, which then the district attorney was obviously not able to pass over to the defense attorney. So you know what that's called, prosecutorial misconduct, and you have Brady issues, and you have juror misconduct. I mean, this was like the perfect storm of issues, and we weren't getting we were so excited about it. When I was an intern at CDPL in the Appellate Defender's Office, I worked on investigating these claims, and it was so rich. We think, well, we're just going to walk into court, and the judge is going to say, "Release the man," and we're going to take him home. And he was denied even a hearing in state court. Like, no judge would even let us present the evidence to him outside of just paper pleadings, and we were thrown out on the intellectual disabilities claim after the law changed. Not even allowed to put an expert up there to tell the judge what his IQ is. The judge was just, get out. I don't want to hear it. And we had to go to federal court. That's what habeas is for. And we went in there, and we were very fortunate to get an obviously sympathetic judge who had been was appointed by Ronald Reagan, had been an assistant, or maybe by George the first Bush, and had been an assistant to Jesse Helms. So clearly we were very excited about getting in front of Judge Boyle, because his history just made it so clear that he was going to be sympathetic on all these issues. It turns out we were right to be grateful that we were in front of him, because it turns out his history made him very sympathetic on these issues. And we ultimately got his conviction vacated, and he was released, charges dismissed in 2006, 2008, somewhere around in there. And I should have quit. Should have stopped working at that point.
But you do make a transition. So you work for the Center for Death Penalty Litigation, which is where I work for you, the Fair Trial Initiative, which you become an executive director, but then eventually decide to, kind of along the way, run for city council, become involved in local politics, which you had already, I guess, had been on your radar. And I just want you to maybe say why you do that. I think that for the most part, our discussions about politics, in my experience, at least within the law school, mostly about national politics. People are not as keyed into kind of local politics, the local scene. I wonder why you made that decision to run for local office rather than working on national campaigns.
Because there wasn't a sidewalk at the corner near the law school at Ridge Road and Country Club. That's why I ran for council. And when I went to complain to people, they're like, "Oh, only people who walk to the intersection are law students." But cars are whizzing by. Who cares? I mean, that was the response we were getting. And so, a few dead law students, who cares? It's almost by design, no pedestrian amenities by the law school. It's just outrageous. The university blamed the the town blamed the university, and so I worked hard in this community group, and we were able to get it passed. And that kind of just little things, little issues like that can just suddenly elevate your name because nobody's doing anything locally. I mean, everybody just stands back and just expects the town mothers and fathers to take care of it. But it's so easy to make noise on local issues. Just go to a couple council meetings. The reporter who doesn't know what to write about, it's like, oh, you're interesting, all right. But suddenly your name's in the paper, and then somebody writes a letter. Yeah, oh yeah, Joe Smith was right. Whenever he was at the council meeting, you're like, wow, I have fans. I didn't even know. And then so it's so easy to do. It's amazing just how democracy really works at the local level. And you can make a difference just by standing up and saying it. So that experience kind of just kind of emboldened me, I suppose. And I ran as a complete unknown council candidate and won. I had fans. It was great. So, but one of the great things about it was not just that as a council member I was able to influence where sidewalks and crosswalks went and bus schedules and stuff. But suddenly now, once you get council member after your name, people want you to hear your views on everything. And once I became mayor, of course, the first few calls that I had asking us to get our troops out of Afghanistan were,
you guys know from common law, that's not what mayors do.
That's not what mayors do. That's not what mayors do. But what I realized is that there's an expectation that this elected official that you might bump into while he's buying his toilet paper at the Harris Teeter might be able to have some say over whether the troops are going to come back from Afghanistan. And you know what? He might actually have the ability to influence that decision. I did not get to do anything. I had no influence at all over the end of the war in Afghanistan. But I have had some influence on transit policy, on and the way the FTA works, and I've had some influence on national gun policy and what the White House says about guns. I've had influence on immigration and immigration issues, which has made me which is, for some reason, I'm on the short list now for Fox News to come anytime the sanctuary city comes up. I had 2 calls this summer, only took one, and you just went to battle with the Fox people. And Ed Lee, anybody from San Francisco? Okay, you are, okay. Ed, I love Ed. Love him. But Ed was just a coward, he wouldn't say anything. No, he's not a coward. Sorry, Ed. He wouldn't say anything, he wasn't defending the policies, at least not where I was hearing that. And so somebody had to say something. So when Fox News called, I just well, you got it all wrong, Fox News. You don't even know what we're talking about, which is what my answers to my questions were. So, even though my primary responsibility is making sure the buses run on time and there's a crosswalk right by the law school or something like that, I get a lot of one of the things I appreciate most about the position I have is that I get to take these concerns that people have in the community and amplify their voices to other levels of government.
There was something, the moment of your election, too, got headlines in a way that maybe ties in some of the...
Yeah, Rachel Maddow mentioned me on TV.
Did you really? Yeah, I didn't realize that. So in 2009 is when the mayor was first elected, and the headlines still, even the ones you can sort of find online, often include the phrase, first openly gay, right? And, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder how that felt for you. I mean, we've actually never talked about this. So I don't know, if at the moment that felt significant to you, or if that was well, these are reporters looking for news, they need to report, Mark Kleinschmidt, openly gay, now elected as the mayor of Chapel Hill, if that felt...
Well, it seems to work better than Mark Kleinschmidt death penalty, lawyer or defender of child killers becomes mayor.
Not a big constituency.
Yeah. So I was pleased because the alternatives just seemed to be worse. But actually, part of my my mentorship relationship I had with Joe Herzenberg, because you remember Joe, I told you about him earlier. was the first openly gay person, LGBT person elected in North Carolina. And when I came to Chapel Hill, he became a mentor, and he was supporting me the whole time I was entering the political arena. And he's like, every second you spend running from the fact that you're gay, you're losing votes. You're affirming the suspicion that homosexuals are secretive and they lurk in shadows and they're not, they want to get, I don't know what they think. And so when you're running from it, every second you're reinforcing that. So, I expected that would be the headlines, because on all my information, I was like, hey, don't forget I'm the gay guy. I think there's some people who were excited about that. They probably balanced off with the number of people who were like turned off by it. So I expected that to be the headline. I was totally comfortable with it. It made sure that during the time when I was single, that people the right people knew.
This is advanced dating metrics. Along that same window that you just identified, it's interesting to think about how much stuff changed between Joe Herzenberg's election and yours. And at the background, it's also just, and this is something that's almost hard to teach in common law these days, is how much the law had changed.
Oh, yeah.
The Constitution. And we'll get to talk about sort of gay marriage in North Carolina specifically, but when you were in law school, Bowers was still the law. Lawrence was decided right around the time I was clerking for you, and these are cases you guys, if you haven't yet, will encounter in common law. I wonder if you can, you remember when Lawrence was decided, was that like I remember
exactly where I was.
Okay, so yeah.
Definitely. Because whenever I was thinking I was never going to be able to be a teacher, even though I had a scholarship that compelled me to be a teacher, or I was going to pay back a lot of money, I was like, oh crap, because I'm gay, I'm going to pay back my scholarship. And it was horrible. But it was the time of Bowers v. Hardwick. And so you read Bowers, it's just unpleasant. But that was the official courts, that was the court opinion on who gay people were. And it was just like clinical, and it was about behavior, and just didn't recognize that the case doesn't recognize the humanity of individuals, and what it means to be able to be in a quality relationship. It's just really offensive. So in 2000, it was the summer of 2003. So at the time I was a council member, and I was dating the mayor of Carborough. It's really interesting.
Our politics.
Yeah. We were going on vacation. And of course, it was the end of June, and council had just finished. We had just finished our last session, and Mike had already taken off. And so I was going to go next. So I'm literally driving to the airport, and I get a call from my then interns, who were telling me on the phone, and I had a cell phone in 2003, and it was one of these little, really tiny, kind of from Zoolander little phones. And I was driving with it, and my interns are all gathered around a speakerphone at CDPL, and they're screaming into the phone, and I was like, "What happened? What happened?" And I thought something happened, I actually maybe won a case. One of my clients going to get relief. No, Lawrence came down. And I'm it's it's great, it's wonderful, everything's good. And because in North Carolina, before that decision came down, I guess it was June 26th-ish, 2003, because that weekend, by the way, is amazing, right? So that's Lawrence weekend, that's the Windsor weekend, that's Obergefell weekend, it's actually Stonewall weekend. It all happens at the same time. And so I was like, oh my God, but I'm going to Montreal, I'm going to the airport, I'm going on vacation. I said, here's the name of the hotel I'm going to, fax me the decision. Because I don't know why we did. I don't know why fax, because I didn't have email. I wouldn't have had access to email. I was staying at a bed and breakfast, and they didn't have. There were days it wasn't Wi-Fi at the B&B, and it was in Canada. So, And so they faxed it, and I get to this bed and breakfast in Montreal at like 2:00 in the morning, and the guy has to wake up and let me in, and I said, "Oh, and by the way, I may have received a fax." Now this is somebody who's like up at 2:00 in the morning because the last guest to the B&B has arrived. He's already like ornery, and he looks, and then when I say that, his eyes open, and these bullets just pour out, and just I'm feeling pummeled by his view, and you. Because they faxed me the whole damn decision, every bit of it, including dissents, and they had an old fax machine that relied on the roll of paper. Yeah, you guys remember this is the kind of like change because it's heat sensitive kind of thing, and so I still have to this day my Lawrence decision on a scroll. It's just like this prized possession that will go in the Kleinschmidt papers in the Wilson Library when I'm done. It's
wonderful.
Oh, it's great.
There's sort of
way too long of a story about.
No,
where
that's a
were you in
fantastic
Lawrence
story.
at?
No, people teaches people about fax machines, which may be informative too for a lot of people. There's another sort of like legal story going on in the background, which you made me think of, which is at the state level.
Mm-hmm.
There are some developments already on the same-sex marriage front. Not all in the direction they are now, but as I remember, there's in 1996 the state passes a law denying same-sex,
DOMA,
specifically denying same-sex marriage at the state level. But
democratically controlled General Assembly.
As was the case for DOMA, sort of naturally, but there are, and I just wanted to ask you about this because I think it's a weird sort of flip of the way things look in Kentucky right now. There are sort of pockets of resistance almost in places like Carrboro, Chapel Hill, and Durham, at least in the early 2000s, around the time of Lawrence being decided about partner benefits and things like that. And I wonder, this I think is just an illustration of how the local politics can sort of be in dialogue maybe with the state law. If you could.
Yeah, we were at the time we were trying to push the law in any way we could, and so it was obviously not marriage. Actually, we didn't even think about marriage. I mean, we thought the Hawaii and Alaska stuff was hilarious in '96, and that was never going to happen in our lifetime. But we were like, how can we protect? How can we? Because we saw big companies like Microsoft and Google wasn't that big yet, but big companies, IBM, were starting to offer domestic partner benefits for employees. I'm like, well, why shouldn't we do that here as employees? We have 900 employees. Let's offer it. And so we started doing that in Chapel Hill and Carrboro and Orange County. Durham joined us, and cities around North Carolina did. Asheville, Boone, Wilmington, other places. And we started pushing on, what the limits of our authority were, and we were challenged. I mean, we were actually. Chapel Hill was sued, and by someone. And I think this was the case where it was who felt I can't sue the town I live in and complain about this policy, so I need a pseudonym to sue under. And the court said okay, and he sued under the name Publix Heterodoxus. Oof. It's just hilarious. Oof. Like everybody knew who he was. Everybody knew who he was at the time. I won't say his name because but everybody at the time knew who he was. He just wanted that name on pleading. Mm-hmm. But he lost. The town of Chapel Hill won, and it was like it was okay for the town to start kind of experimenting with the limits of our authority to protect our LGBT employees. But there's nothing we could do about people in the community. So beyond. Ensuring that our laws weren't violative of anyone's First Amendment rights and their own ability to express themselves, then there was very little we could do.
And then sort of roughly a decade later, in 2012, for those of you who lived in the state at the time, you'll remember this very well, the Amendment 1 campaign is going on. And I wonder if if you were surprised, disappointed the way that, disappointed, but surprised the way that played out, or if you'd expected more maybe about...
Well, I think I actually had sat in this room in 2012 and was like talking to law students then about how they get involved in the Amendment 1 battle. And if you were to roll that tape, you would hear me say, we're going to win, it's okay. We're going to stop Amendment 1, it's all right. Now, I just need you to go do these things. If you don't do it, then it'll pass. It'll be your fault. And that's what I was telling everybody. I was like, all you need is the energy. And I just put it out there, because I never ran a campaign. I wasn't running that campaign, but I never ran one of my own campaigns thinking for a second I was going to lose. Because there's just, and that might seem egotistical, but if I did in fact lose, I'd have all that time afterwards to cry or whatever. So, I mean, I need to focus, and I wanted everyone else to. But at the end of the day, yeah, I wasn't surprised that it passed. But what was some great news out of that, though, every urban precinct in Winston-Salem voted against it. Every urban precinct in Guilford County, Greensboro voted against it. Orange County, completely. Durham County, completely. People voted against it like that. I mean, I had precincts 97% no. There's one precinct in Chapel Hill, 6 voted for the amendment in this one precinct. Only 6 people voted for it, and they probably didn't understand it. And if it gets down to that number, they're probably thinking, "Oh, I should vote for this because I like the gays." Yes, but they're wrong. It's like, no, the answer is no. So there's just that. So there's great news that we had these places in our state that were truly welcoming communities, and so it was a base on which we knew we could build continuing support for change.
There's an interesting thing about Amendment 1, which there's captured well in the first line of a law review article that we were talking about this morning by Lydia Lavelle, who's the mayor of Carrboro and a law professor over at NC Central. And I think the opening line of her article is that North Carolina now has the distinction of being the last state ever to pass a ban on gay marriage, because at the same time Amendment 1 gets passed, there's litigation sort of going through the courts in lots of different places, including the Fourth Circuit, a case brought, I think, by the ACLU, of which you were once president, the North Carolina chapter of the ACLU, which culminates in this decision in 2014.
Actually, the ACLU case did not bring marriage equality to North Carolina on October 10th, 2014.
Oh, then
No.
fill in the story.
It was the United Church of Christ versus Cooper that brought marriage equality to North Carolina on October 10th. And I was on that one.
All right, tell about that one.
So I'm not giving, even though I was the president of ACLU at one time,
your case.
They didn't do it.
Yeah.
We did it.
Nice. This is the other mark. So tell me how that case came about.
Well, my law partners and I were thinking, how can we find a way to be creative around getting into court? Who are some interesting plaintiffs that will kind of catch the imagination of our judges? And we know that we always knew that the 14th Amendment was the critical argument, and that would win the day. But we wanted to partner with another issue, so we went out looking for religious people of faith, religious ministers, people who wanted to get married in their churches. And the United Church of Christ was so enthusiastic about protecting the religious freedoms of their ministers, so to allow them to be able to perform marriages, that they as a denomination came on board. And see, one of the things that was interesting is that in North Carolina, if you perform a marriage and you purport to evoke the power of the state to in solemnizing you've committed, and you in fact aren't able to do that, you're committing a misdemeanor. So it's a criminal act that these UCC ministers and everyone else was doing in solemnizing. This is the argument. I know they weren't really evoking the state, but this is the argument. In solemnizing these unions, they could arguably have been subject to criminal sanction. So it was like, okay, bingo. We knew that wasn't going to be the issue that won. But it brought in this extraordinary class of plaintiffs. Once the UCC came out as a denomination, there were rabbis and Baptist ministers, and you just pick a faith community, and they were all wanting to get onto the case. So we ended up having this just rainbow of ecumenical leadership as plaintiffs, and that's the case that won.
That's interesting, and that's useful for our purposes that that's the case that won, because the way that it was litigated brings those sort of claims of faith to the forefront, which of course brings us back to
how ironic. Religious liberty was our argument for marriage equality.
So in the wake of your victory and Obergefell, we have, just for anybody who's not looked at a newspaper in the last couple weeks or couple months, we've had at least one very high-profile incident, and the one in Kentucky is the one that's getting the most attention, of this clerk, Kim Davis, who's refusing to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples because she says it's literally literally, I think, a matter of heaven and hell for her, that her soul literally in danger. So I wonder, having sort of thought about having sort of brought your case with some sort of sympathy for these religious views, if you look at a Kim Davis and think, I understand where she's coming from, and I have a view of we should try to accommodate that kind of religious belief.
I have great sympathy for her. Assuming she honestly and sincerely holds these religious beliefs, I have a great deal of sympathy for her. It's a multifaceted kind of sympathy, though. I mean, it's like, I feel sorry for her that she feels trapped in something. I feel sorry for her that this is her faith choices, But, whatever. I feel sorry for her. It's got to be unpleasant, using an exposed toilet in a jail cell. But we have so many ways of accommodating her. She could be a paralegal in a law firm. She could be a bus driver. She could be a clerk at the store down the street. She's not being forced to be the clerk of court. And she doesn't, she has a job that requires her to be the vehicle through which citizens access services from the government. Services you can't get from the private sector because the government jealously holds on to them, and so you cannot get anything, you cannot get a marriage license from anyone else but us. So you must come through this door, and she is the guardian of that door, and it's her job to open it for people who qualify. And it's not her job to decide what the qualifications are to pass through the door. It's to hear what the law says those qualifications are, and then open the door. That's her job. If she can't do it, then she needs to find another one. And as we were talking earlier about did anybody see the New York Times on Sunday, the opinion section, the comic? Let me see it. It's a great comic. It's the multi-panel comic where, so imagine the government EMT, right, works for the county government, comes and picks you up. You've broken your leg, and then the EMT says to you, I'm sorry, I can't give you pain medicine because I just recently converted to Christian Science. And I have a sincerely held religious belief that doesn't work. And they start, whatever, that you just are not allowed to be an EMT anymore. I mean, it's just so axiomatic. There is no colorable argument to defend her in that regard. She's not a baker. No. She's not a photographer. She's not offering private services. She's not even, she doesn't even run a religious institution of any kind. I mean, where you start having to really worry, I think, about religious freedoms. She's a government official.
Maybe I'll ask this last question and then open up, because I'm sure you guys have some questions. We said about accommodation, I guess it was a nice place to bring us to the North Carolina bill, or SB 2. If you've been reading the Times this week, you may have seen that, I think it was yesterday morning or the day before, there was an op-ed by a guy from the Heritage Foundation arguing strongly in favor of North Carolina's approach to these accommodation matters, which is to statutorily provide, well, you can maybe tell us kind of what SB 2 is all about, but North Carolina has taken a step before the Kim Davis thing even came about, to arguably accommodate those with, and I think you used the phrase, sincerely held religious objections is sort of the key word from the bill. But maybe tell us about how it came about.
And actually, anything that just merely burdens them. At least that's how our RFRA was, and so I don't know how our SB 2 is going to be. But Senate Bill 2 does kind of what Kim Davis would like the law of Kentucky to do, which is to exempt people who are gatekeepers for access to government services, in this case, marriage licenses, or the solemnization of a marriage, to be able to be excused from that duty. So magistrates, by the way, if you're not from North Carolina, there's only two kinds of people in North Carolina who can perform marriages. And they are ministers, reverends, preachers, whatever, people who have, who have, that class. The other class is magistrates. And that's it. There's nobody else that can preside over a wedding and have it be a legal marriage. So if you're not a religious person, and it's just not or even if you are, you just don't want to go there with the preacher or then you go to the magistrate. It's the only door. Again, they're the only folks who open the door to marriage equality. But if that individual has a sincerely held religious belief, then they can exempt themselves from having to perform marriages, any marriages. And our law, I think, is particularly challenging, though, for us. Those of us who think a government official should just do the job that it's described, to them, because it's hard to get to the harm, because they did a really good job of crafting this law. A magistrate or deputy register of deeds, who's also another official in the process of filing the marriage certificate, can exempt themselves, and when they do, they participate in no marriages whatsoever, right? So not just same-sex marriages, but any marriage. They exempt themselves from all of them. And they do that, on their own motion. So it's not like they wait till somebody comes in and asks for a marriage license, and they can just go and get this exemption done. So it's very difficult to have a harm occur. Like, where's the conflict that creates the crisis, that creates the controversy in the case for a court to decide that this is unconstitutional and that government officials should do their jobs? It's really hard for us to do that. And if every magistrate in a county, because that's what you say, well, what if all the magistrates? Okay, if all the magistrates in the county recuse themselves, district court chief judges aren't excused by this, and if all magistrates go away, they are then instantly empowered to conduct weddings, and they can do it, and they have to then institute a plan in which at least 10 hours a week people can get married in that county. So it's like, how do you get to it? I think it's clearly runs against what we think of how good government should work, or any government should work. It's born of our American Revolution, but it's very hard to figure out how we're going to get to the case. I don't know. You're the law professor.
I was just about to ask the room. That's what our brilliant students are for. Let me actually open it up, because I've been talking the whole time. Questions, legal theories about how perhaps to challenge SB 2.
How do we do it?
Yeah.
I have no idea. I do have a question. What you think about what's going on in Tennessee? So there was the case where the 60-year-old couple wanted to get a divorce, and the Tennessee judge said, well, actually, I can't decide whether you get a divorce or not, because the Supreme Court has now defined what marriage is. So I can't define what marriage is not. It's great. It's hilarious. But and a lot of conservatives are kind of starting to follow this line of reasoning. I think it's very interesting. It's very sarcastic. They're saying well, we're not powerful enough to decide this, obviously. And I thought that was a pretty interesting take on it. I wonder where that's going to go, because it's just on the heels of.
But it goes nowhere, right? Because it's just stupid. It's stupid. The difference here is that the law tells you what it is. See, for Kim Davis and for every magistrate in North Carolina, the courts and the law have told us who qualifies to be married. Check the boxes. Do you fill them all? Then issue the damn license. Perform the damn marriage. Right? For that judge in Tennessee, the law tells the judge how to dissolve a marriage. Check the damn boxes and issue the decree. The end. You don't have to appeal to your higher power. It's right there in the law. And see, that's the difference that's between between those who are fighting for equality in these instances, and these cartoonish results. It's just like the cartoon that was in the New York Times this weekend. And then one of them was like a dog catcher. I refuse to catch this rabid raccoon because I believe all God's creatures are, beautiful. And it's like, no, you don't get to do that. If you are a government official, you just don't. That's not how. It's just like that. It's not how it works. It's just stupid, and it's offensive, because every day since I was able to finally pry the last lock off my closet, right? I have been fighting for equality. And this has been 25-ish years more than that. One of the things that I've had to deal with ever since then, and anybody in here who's part of the movement will know what I'm talking about, is that when you start making argument, when you start engaging with people on the issue, invariably it turns into a joke for them. The whole identity of what it means to be gay or lesbian, transgender or bisexual, to them, they distill it into a joke. And it used to always win. As soon as they distilled me into a joke, they won. And the court said, that's fine. They actually said that's fine. And it didn't, it all comes down to, there's no other group. I mean, we have the right to get married, yet you still can sit on a bench and make jokes about us. It's just, there's still so much more that needs to be done. I mean, of course, like Hillary Clinton says, you're not going to change hearts and minds. I mean, remember her Black Lives Matter conversation? All you can do is fight to change policies. And so we've been changing it, but it's so clear that hearts and minds aren't there yet with so many people. And they feel like they can win by just distilling it all down into a joke. At the end of the day, all those arguments, that's all they are. It's just, that's not even an argument. And it's a judge that's saying this? It's pathetic. I mean, what else can you say to that?
Professor Siegel had a hand for the answer. I don't know.
This is a great conversation, and I appreciate your, Mr. Mayor, your fire and your humor and your willingness to spend some time with us. So how do we make it right? How do we make it hard for you? How do we make you defend your position, which you articulate very eloquently in ways that might trouble folks in the room? So it sounds like you agree with Justice Scalia on
on the First Amendment flag burning case, yeah.
No, on the permissibility of exceptions for government officials, right? So he's taken a hard line, get over it view when it comes to the death penalty. And he said that if you are a judge and you are troubled by the death penalty and you can't in good faith apply it, resign. I don't want to hear it. Resign. You've got a job to do. And
I think that's right. I know lots of judges who've had to preside over those kind of cases and have had to watch death sentences get handed down in front of them in their courtroom.
yeah, but,
They did their job.
But resign, versus recuse. What about, abolitionist judges in the first half of the 19th century who were very troubled by slavery? You can't do your job, just resign?
I guess you're right. Kim Davis is Rosa Parks.
Well, is it really, right, does it really just come down to that? Just different views about the substance? Or can we have, a trans-substantive conversation about the responsibilities of government officials? And sometimes, if you take up, if the other side is making jokes, I'm with you. I have no use for that Tennessee judge, and I think he deserves what I hope is coming. But if we stipulate that the Kim Davises of the world have sincerely held religious beliefs, can we simply say, do your job and resign? Or are there ways of thinking of accommodations that don't result in material or dignitary harms to gay people who want to get married?
I don't think so. I think, I understand what you're saying. I think that argument becomes much more challenging when we talk about the larger general RFRA questions, the religious freedom questions that, allow the baker to not bake the cake or the photographer not to participate in the wedding photography and that kind of stuff. Because I think when you get into private institutions and even religious schools in particular, then it becomes a real challenge. And I think we have to come up with a solution that allows for folks, particularly when they're providing their, I can't believe I'm saying this, but they are, even though they're holding themselves out to the public, we still need to be able to accommodate, I think, their religious beliefs. I think it's just an unresolved question that I'm not satisfied with any of the answers that have been proposed. But I think when you get to being a government official, I think everything else changes. All that stuff changes. She ran for that office. I mean, it's like me deciding I don't want to preside over council meetings. Of course I have to preside. It's my job. I have to do that. I have to distribute an agenda. I have to, issue proclamations or whatever, under whatever rubric I said that the council tells me I have to do it. That's just my job. If I don't want it, I could just not file, right? I mean, I don't understand how you find room in a government official, particularly an elected one like Kim Davis. You find room to, I don't know if particularly elected is necessarily relevant, how you find room to excuse them from what they signed up to do. How do you do it? And still give the people who set up the government to handle these monopolies that the government has around certain services and how to fairly distribute and carry those things out. How then do you give the citizens the access to the services and that they set up the government to do to begin with? I think it undermines the contract between citizen and government, and I'm going to obey my laws, you obey I'm going to obey the laws, you obey the laws. We're all under the law. That's the deal we have with each other, and particularly if you're going to be an official who actually does the things that the government says and actualizes the will of the people, then I don't think there's room. I really don't. I think Scalia's right, sure. But I've seen, on that issue, and I've seen judges suck it up and preside over cases that ended in death sentence. I've just seen it happen.
I hate to end on a death sentence, but or end on nice to end on the Scalia's right line. But we are at the hour mark. So let me just in closing say to all of you guys, if you're interested in talking about these issues more, I'm sure the mayor has a couple minutes.
Sure. The
mayor is also involved in a re-election campaign right now. So if you want to talk about local politics or what that's like,
we live in Chapel Hill.
It's not an ACS endorsement. This is just if you're interested in being involved in local politics or campaigns, please talk to him there, and please join me in thanking the mayor.
Hey, thank you.